Good afternoon. On behalf of the Palkiwala Foundation, Chennai, I have great pleasure in welcoming you to the 37th Palkiwala Memorial Lecture by Mr. Vinod Rai on the topic Role of Public Institutions in Ensuring Good Governance. The Palkiwala Foundation, Chennai, a charitable public trust, came into being in February 2003 as an outcome of a few admirers of Nani Palkiwala desiring to perpetuate the memory of this legendary figure. Considering his lasting contribution to the molding of public thought and debate, the Foundation felt that its foremost objective should be to hold public lectures by eminent speakers on subjects of contemporary relevance. In January this year, the Honorable Union Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, delivered the Palkiwala Centenary Celebrations Lecture in Chennai. I would now like to briefly introduce our speaker for today. An alumnus of Hindu College, Delhi School of Economics, and Harvard's Kennedy School, Mr. Vinod Rai started his career in the Indian Administrative Service in 1972. He rose to become the 11th Comptroller and Auditor General of India in January 2008 and demitted office in May 2013 after a very active and news-making tenure. In 2016, Mr. Rai was appointed the first chairman of the newly created Banks Board Bureau. Between January 2017 and October 2019, he was chairman of the Supreme Court mandated Committee of Administrators of the Board of Control for Cricket in India. Mr. Vinod Rai is a distinguished visiting research fellow at the University of South Asian Studies in the National University of Singapore, and a member of the Global Board of Trustees of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation in London. He is the author of the books Not Just an Accountant, The Diary of a Nation's Conscience Keeper, and Rethinking Good Governance, Holding to Account India's Public Institutions. Mr. Rai was awarded the Padma Bhushan in 2016. His talk today will be followed by a question and answer session moderated by Mr. R. Anand, trustee of the Palkiwala Foundation. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box. Mr. S. Mahalingam, trustee, will offer closing remarks. Thank you. I now request Mr. Vinod Rai to deliver his address.
Mr. Anand, Mr. Mahalingam, Mr. Balaji, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity that you have given me to speak in the centenary year of the Mr. Palkiwala's the foundation. Now, I feel privileged to be able to speak at an event which is in memory of a person so distinguished, a person so well regarded, a person who I never had the good fortune of meeting, but a person who has been an icon in very many ways. Nani Palkiwala was a legend, not only of his times, but many more, and will remain so in years to come. He strode like a Goliath, not only on the legal world, but public space in general. Anything I may say in praise of Mr. Palkiwala, I'm sure each one of you, ladies and gentlemen, who are participating in today's events would have heard. So I don't propose to dwell too much upon it. I just want to draw your attention to two things. Number one, in 1990, he wrote that the most persistent tendency in India is to have too much government, but too little governance. Too many laws, too little justice. Too many public servants and too little public service. Too many controls and too little welfare. And he had the vision to be able to say this. And I want to draw your attention to a small issue which, throws light on the persona, on the thinking of the gentleman. In December 1989, Mr. Soli Sohrabji was appointed as the Attorney General of India. Nani, in congratulating him, wrote, and I'm reading, "My dear Soli, I meant to write to you to congratulate you on your appointment as the Attorney General. But after reading your public statement, I would like to congratulate India on having you as the highest law officer of the government. What you have said about the Attorney General Office, and in quotes, the guardian of public interest and the promoter of human rights, quotes end, is so true and so little understood. The greatest glory of the Attorney General is not to win cases for the government, but to ensure that justice is done to the people, the citizens of India. Now, all that attention I'm trying to draw to is that he leaves the government aside, but he says the focus is the citizen of India, and to which the Attorney General must devote himself, to the welfare of whom the Attorney General must devote himself. A remarkable perspective that he gives. Now, that's why I said I don't propose to say more in this centenary year of his being here around. I'm conscious also as I speak to you today that I'm probably addressing some of those who know Parliament and parliamentarians better, because I propose to talk about institutions in the governance setup, and I propose to talk about Parliament. I propose to talk about the Supreme Court. I've taken courage to talk about the Supreme Court, and I will talk about the Reserve Bank of India. So that's why I say that I'm probably addressing some of those who know Parliament and parliamentarians better than me. Some of those who have entered the portals of the Supreme Court multitude times, many more times than I have. And others who may have sat on the boards, committees of RBI for years and understand monetary policy far better than me. While I dwell on these subjects, please bear with me. Bear with me as I articulate my opinion, an opinion obviously of which there is no dearth in this country, but I console myself as being able to speak on these subjects as probably being an insider in a large number of ways. Now, public institutions support good governance, which in turn promotes sustainable economic development and thereby nurtures the welfare of the people. The most vital bond between a people and its government is that of trust. It is on the strength of these institutions that these public institutions which help maintain that trust. And it is on the strength of these institutions that the distance between the ruler and the ruled gets reduced, and the ruler is made accountable to the ruled. These institutions serve as the pillars supporting the foundation of any robust and vibrant democracy. Weakening the strength of any of these pillars leads to the foundation of the democratic fabric being shaken. The need of the hour is to build institutional capability, to enforce laws and regulations, and to incentivize action which contributes to nation building. And that is why I maintain that institutions script the destiny of nations. And why do I say so? Now, every democratic country seeks to build a prosperous and progressive nation by being responsive to the needs and aspirations of its citizens. Now, such a prosperous nation will not only require a responsible and capable leadership, but also a structure through which this leadership can administer and through which the citizens can hold such leadership accountable. The structure is provided by the institutions that facilitate governance. And in any parliamentary democracy like India, the people delegate their rights to legislate to their representatives in parliament. And to ensure that parliament functions in the interest of the citizen, certain rights have been granted to the citizen, and the Supreme Court has been mandated the power to ensure that the rule of law and the rights of citizens are protected. Similarly, the Constitution and the Parliament have created institutions specifically empowered to carry forward the stated objectives, and in the process ensure that a balance of power has also accountability of those mandated to administer through these institutions is maintained. Now, the economic development and well-being of the people is dependent on how well these institutions are administered and how well they perform the role mandated to them. It is thus these institutions which script the destiny of nations. Now, I propose to deal with two constitutional creations and one regulatory institution. Now, Parliament is the most representative and visible institution upholding democratic values. India was among the pioneers in granting universal adult suffrage, as you all know, to itself, a facility which the US approved only in 1920 after 144 years, and the UK in 1918 after 100 years. This bold decision was taken despite the fact that barely 14% of the population was literate at that time, and India had just recovered from a very painful partition. Now, the challenges facing the Indian Parliament have been immense. Analysis points to a distinct, and I'm making the point, a distinct decline in recent years in the effectiveness of Parliament as an institution of accountability and oversight over the executive. Instruments that Parliament can use for accountability, such as motions on the floor of the House, the quality of debates, the committee system, etc., are increasingly being rendered ineffective and dysfunctional. You will all recall that in December 2010, the whole winter session of Parliament ended without transacting any substantial business. This is probably the only occasion in parliamentary history when an entire session was washed out due to a standoff between the government and the opposition. Last year witnessed another first in the history of Parliament. The annual financial statement or budget is among the most important bills discussed in Parliament. Thousands of man-hours go into the formulation of the budget document. It is a task of utmost priority, with all preparatory deliberations being conducted in utmost secrecy. And due to disruptions, the budget was passed by a voice vote. No debate at all. Why has this become the trend? Now, Parliament comprises of members who populate it, who get elected as our representatives. I found that an analysis by the Association of Democratic Reforms of the 16th Lok Sabha, constituted after the general election of 2014, had concluded that the largest number of politicians with criminal records was elected to this parliament in that election. The analysis, which covered 541 of the 543 winning candidates, showed that 186 members, mind you, 1/3 of the members of parliament, declared that they had criminal cases pending against them. In the 2009 election, the number of such MPs was 158, as against 186 in 2014. Of these, 112 had declared that the cases pertain to murder, attempt to murder, kidnapping, and crimes against women, all very major crimes. In the general election of 2019, it is reported that as against 34% of the parliamentarians having a criminal record in the 2014 election, this time the figure was 43%. This is mind-boggling And there is a remarkable case of an elected MP from Ghosi constituency in Uttar Pradesh. He was accused of rape and has been on the run, was on the run after an FIR was registered against him on 1st May 2019. He was denied interim bail by the Supreme Court on 17 May. He approached the court again on 27 May after being elected for protection from arrest. When the vacation bench, presided over by the Chief Justice, asked his counsel how many criminal cases he had pending against him, the reply was 16. And he's been out on bail since then. Now, one distressing observation made in the ADR report is that chances of such candidates winning was being proven to be higher than those contesting and those who have a clean record. The trend, however, is indicative that firstly, parties are increasingly choosing local muscle men, if I can say so, as their candidates. Why? Because their winnability factor is high. Secondly, whereas these elements used to be the power behind the parliamentarian earlier, they have now chosen to come up front and have received encouragement to be the front themselves. Thirdly, the fact that courts take inordinately long to decide cases, these elements are free, they have a free run for most of their tenure in the House. Owing to this factor, the deterrence aspect has been totally blunted. Now, what are the instruments of good governance or oversight that the Parliament has? Now, the Constitution places upon the MPs a very onerous responsibility. The responsibility to hold the executive accountable to the elected representatives. This oversight can be exercised through the mechanism of the question hour, the 0 hour, committees, and other debates in the House. In fact, the inquisition to which the members can be subjected to, or the ministers can be subjected to by members during question hour, is very effective in establishing the accountability of the executive to the Parliament. Experienced and consummate parliamentarians utilize this opportunity to put the government under a scanner, and at times can even embarrass people or ministers who have not been prepared appropriately. Despite all these provisions, effective scrutiny of the government has in the past been diluted by the very fact that Parliament sessions get disrupted, question hour is drowned in sloganeering by MPs, and the new phenomenon of members trooping into the well of the House and not permitting the Speaker to conduct the proceedings has become a very distressing sight. More important committees, the Public Accounts Committee, the Public Undertakings Committee, the Estimate Committees are the ones who, if functioning objectively and judicially, would have been holding the executive to account. I will take the case of the PSC, to whom all reports of the Controller and Auditor General are referred. Now, the CAG places roughly about 40 reports in Parliament every year. Now, in a study which was conducted, again, by the PRS Legislative Research, it indicates that in the current millennium, in the period up to 2006, the PAC met at an average of 19 times in a year. But after that, up to 2019, it has met barely 11 times in a year. Now, such sporadic meetings can hardly lead to any kind of meaningful examination of the report submitted, or have the Parliament hold the executive or the department or the ministry concerned to account. A word about members of Parliament. As I mentioned earlier, the Parliament faces a daunting challenge as modern legislation places a responsibility upon the capacity and political awareness of members of parliament, but who seem to be least inclined to shoulder that responsibility to address the subject under discussion in the House. This is a direct consequence of the caliber of those who enter the parliament. Considering the number of cases pending against each elected members, the greater fear is that those mandated to undertake lawmaking may become lawbreakers themselves. Now, I'm quoting a former speaker, Mr. Somnath Chatterjee, who, being anguished by the number of disruptions, observed, quote, "The whole country is ashamed of its parliamentarians. The parliament may still be a great institution, but its members are no longer great men. How long can a great institution remain great in the hands of small men?" That was his observation when he was expressing anguish. Further, these committees have begun to operate entirely along partisan lines. So any issue that is being discussed gets divided, treasury benches and opposition benches against each other. The merit of the subject being discussed gets forgotten. Also, you will find that there has been a large profusion of parties in parliament. So there are very small blocks. They never unite as an opposition to take on the government or take up an issue with unity against the government. Ultimately, all in all, Parliament seems to be losing its efficacy in fiscal management, the economy, social policy, in the terms on which India is integrated into the global economy, because of no other reason, but I would feel self-abdication, and not because of any uncontrollable exogenous factors. And the decline in the image of Parliament requires immediate corrective action. And there is no other function but for parliamentarians and Parliament to rejuvenate itself and establish trust between itself and the people that they represent. Most importantly, disruptions in Parliament functioning must cease. Issues need to be deliberated and decided upon rather than be rushed through. Political parties must ensure that their members can serve as a role model to the public and are worthy of the trust reposed in them. And I think there can be no other corrective action or improvement but from within itself. Now, all that the Parliament deliberates on, lots of these issues go to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has, in the 70 years of independent India, been a bedrock for good governance. And I have seen it from my civil service life. I've seen as the Auditor General, you have great trust in the functioning of the Supreme Court, because independent India experienced a very strong judicial and constitutional culture, which has by and large supported good governance. The judiciary has been a protector of fundamental rights. It has enhanced the citizens' personal security and ability to pursue developmental goals. A proactive Supreme Court, unmindful of the mindset of the executive, has been instrumental in striking down government legislation when it interferes with constitutional provisions and transgresses into liberties of the common. The court, in 7 decades of independent India, has shown remarkable dynamism in interpreting the Constitution and ensuring that the welfare of the common man remains paramount. And that's why I had the quote of Nani Palkhiwala, as I mentioned earlier. This has provided the citizen the confidence that his liberties and constitutional rights are well protected and in safe hands. Recent years, recent times, you and I have been concerned about lots of issues which have crossed the portals of the Supreme Court. And I take one incident, 12 January 2018, where a group of senior-most judges of the Supreme Court held a press conference And what did they say? A small extract, and I quote, "It is with no pleasure that we are compelled to call this press conference. But sometimes administration of the Supreme Court is not in order, and many things which are less than desirable have happened in the last few months. About a couple of months back, 4 of us gave a signed letter to the Chief Justice of India. We wanted a particular thing to be done in a particular manner. But the way it was done, it raised further questions about the integrity of the institution." This is Justice Chelmeshwar addressing the media, and he was talking about the integrity of the institution, that citadel, that bedrock that I earlier talked about. This was a statement of the second most senior judge of the Supreme Court. And indeed, he was talking about the CGI. By any standards, a most alarming and ominous reference. It could have been kept indoors. But on that winter morning, sitting in Justice Chelmeshwar's residence, the 4 senior-most judges, looking exceedingly distressed, did the unthinkable by addressing the press, faulting their own in front of a battery of cameras. This, I think, constitutes a landmark in the history of the court. The court has seen dissensions. There have been any number of them, but all of them have been contained within the portals of the walls of the court itself. And a court which has been steeped in history. When this court came into existence in 1950, it functioned from the Parliament building. Its sittings, till this new building was constructed, was in the Chamber of Princes in the Parliament building itself. I think that Chamber of Princes now is the Parliament Library, but it functioned from there. And over the years has been the protection, has provided protection of fundamental rights. And I say this, I bring this to notice again, because in 2, 3, 4 cases where fundamental rights were involved, a lot of the credit of drawing the attention of the court to citizens' rights go to Mr. Nani Palkhiwala, who appeared in these cases. I mean, fundamental rights, the review in 1973 in the landmark case of Keshavanand Bharti versus Kerala. The issue was contended because the seer from Kasaragod had maintained that under Article 21 of the Constitution, he had fundamental rights. Now this was contested because the Kerala government had introduced land reforms. The ashram contested it under Article 26, concerning the right to manage religiously owned property without government interference. Case was heard by the largest ever constitutional bench of 13 judges over 5 months, as it is expected to profoundly affect the basic features of democracy. Nani Palkhiwala argued it. He was on his feet for 32 of these 66 days that the case was argued. And the 13-judge bench deliberated on the limitations, and a sharply divided verdict, 7:1, which we all know. The court held that the parliament had wide powers, but it did not have the power to destroy or emasculate the basic elements of fundamental feature of the Constitution. It was the thought process, the argument espoused by Nani Palkhiwala, that the basic structure doctrine was enunciated by the court in that particular. I allude to 3 other judgments. The judgment of 1975, after 1975, when the emergency was called. Again, in the habeas corpus petition case, where Article 21 was called into, maintaining that the detainees could not have their fundamental rights be suspended even during periods of national emergency. The bench, 4:1, maintained that with the issuance of the Presidential Order of 27 June 75, no person has any locus to move any writ petition under Article 226 before a High Court for habeas corpus or any other writ or order to challenge, because the fundamental rights continued to be at that particular time suspended. Justice H.R. Khanna was the only one who dissented, and it's widely believed that because of that dissent, he lost his opportunity to become CJI, but that's a different issue. This judgment was seen as an abject surrender of the court to the then political executive. You will recall that 3 decades later, Justice P.N. Bhagwati, one of the 4 judges, regretted his decision as being one of those 4 judges. The 39th Amendment Bill of 1975 again placed the election of the President, Vice President above the courts. This was again struck down by the Supreme Court, and it paved the way for restoration of democracy. During the emergency, the clauses that were introduced in the 42nd Amendment, in Article 368, all these in the Minerva Mills case was again struck down. This was the strength of the Supreme Court taking on the executive and ensuring that the fundamental rights remains paramount, and any decision of Parliament cannot overcome that basic structure of the Parliament. But of course, and you would have recently read, all of you would have read the statement made by the Attorney General, Mr. K.K. Venugopal, 3 years back in the court, drawing attention to his speech in 1987. He mentioned in that speech that whispers and indeed open talk had taken place about misconduct among judges in the Supreme and the High Court. Past few years have seen the court embroiled in several controversies. There have been allegations, serious allegations. There were issues regarding the appointments of the collegium, where the Supreme Court had the collegium practice from 1993. But it was felt that this was not a perfect arrangement, so the NDA government brought forth the NGAC bill, as we are all aware. The bill was not only passed by Parliament, 20 states also passed it. No sooner was it passed, obviously public interest litigations were filed. The Supreme Court delivered a 100-page judgment holding that any involvement of the executive in the appointment of judges impinges upon the independence of the judiciary and is violative of the principle of separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary, which is a basic feature of the Constitution. And obviously the verdict, unleashed a barrage of questions. Now, largely because India is the only country where judges get to select judges. Our system is very different from that which prevails in other democracies, maybe the UK, the US, and Canada. In each of these countries, the legislature or eminent persons outside the judiciary also undertake the selection. It was largely felt that the collegium is some kind of an old boys club. And there have been allegations of the government attempting to appoint judges who have been pliable. So much can be argued on both the sides too, but I return to the press conference of 12th January 2018. People, including legal eagles, have taken pot shots at the event with divergent views, depending upon which side of the political divide they sit. The executive always reacts with glee at dissension within courts. They have their own agenda. It will be very difficult to sit in judgment whether the act was wise or otherwise. But the factor of collegiality demands that dissension in such high constitutional bodies is best kept within the walls, because it has been famously observed and repeatedly too that a citadel never falls but from within. And in this particular case, by sharing it with the public, it did not do the Supreme Court very good. Supreme Court, which had delivered judgments like the Kesavananda Bharati verdict. Now, the reverberations of the Supreme Court had, press conference had just died down when there were allegations about the CJI, and now we have tweets on which contempt verdicts have been passed. In the final analysis, the Supreme Court's evolution in independent India has been such that it has largely retained its stature and been lauded for pushing the country in a liberal direction, ensuring that societal reforms and the socio-economic ethos remains progressive. In recent times, it has handed out progressive judgments by abolishing instant divorce, declaring privacy a fundamental right, and ordering states to lift a ban on films that hardline Hindu groups found objectionable. The court had the conviction as a defender of the Constitution to protect the various freedoms in the dark days of the emergency. Expounding the basic structure doctrine, it put the interests of the common man above anything else. The court has displayed heartwarming dynamism in interpreting the law in sync with the times. A remarkable achievement of the court has been its use of the Constitution as a tool to provide a bedrock for good governance. When all else was crumbling over time, the court, time and again, has come to the rescue of the nation, thereby being a course corrector for good governance. And all institutions that take on a progressive role have to introspect on when and how they dismount the typhoon. All that I need and all that I dare say is trust and respect for an individual or an institution cannot be commanded. It has to be earned. Earning trust can come about only when Caesar's wife is seen to remain above suspicion. I dare not say more on this issue. But among the institutions which are other than constitutional, regulatory, and created by statutes, a remarkable agency which I would like to allude to, an institution, is the Reserve Bank of India. I wonder if you have noticed that in each currency note that you see above the denomination of 1 rupee, it says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of rupees, say, 100. This is the promise of the governor. He signs below that. What is the sanctity of that promise? How does it figure out between the Reserve Bank and the government? Because the government, in fact, decides the value of that currency. Take the remarkable case of 1965, after the war with Pakistan, 2 successive bouts. They had put severe pressure on the economy. Value of the rupee was under duress, was under stress. Devaluation was the only alternative. The Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, was pushed to the wall. She had to take that very difficult decision. Her finance minister was not supporting her. But I believe on 5th June, she signed the file, she took the decision. And it is said that she was so tense, she was so stressed, that after signing that file, she watched the film Dr. Zhivago to overcome her nervousness because of the announcement which had to be made the next day. The rupee from 4.76 to the dollar was being devalued to 7.50. Now, between the Reserve Bank and the government, the monetary authority and the fiscal authority, you will always find tension. It's a healthy tension. In fact, the very first governor of the Reserve Bank, Sir Osborne Smith, he had a difference between him and the then finance minister on the lowering of the bank rate. The finance minister felt it had to be lowered. The governor was not willing. The governor resigned. In 1950, there were differences between the then finance minister, T.T. Krishnamachari, whom you all know very well, and the governor, Sir Benegal Ramarao. TTK seemed to pay scant respect to the autonomy of the RBI and made no bones about calling it a department of the government. The governor even went to the extent of complaining to the prime minister that the finance minister behaved in an intemperate manner with him. The last straw on the camel's back was when the finance minister announced the monetary policy in parliament, which the governor, and very rightfully thought was his prerogative. And in any case, what he announced was different from what the RBI was to announce the next day. Seeing no other viable option for himself, the governor resigned, despite attempts being made by such persons as the then Home Minister, Mr. G.B. Pant, and of course, the Prime Minister. There have been such large number of such incidents, large number of milestones, but the Reserve Bank has stood the test of time. L.K. Jha, for example, did not favor nationalization. He favored only social control of banks, but Mrs. Gandhi came forward with nationalization. And then L.K. Jha wanted to quit, but then he got posted out, and he was, I think, posted out as ambassador later on. And Mrs. Gandhi took on the finance portfolio herself. There's a very interesting incident which Dr. C. Rangarajan has talked about relating to 1991, when the Chandrasekhar government had become very tenuous because of the withdrawal of support by the Congress. The foreign exchange position of the country was in dire straits. The government or the Reserve Bank tried with the Bank of England, with the Bank of Japan, with the International Monetary Fund for some loan, foreign currency loan. It was not forthcoming, and they all felt that India must hypothecate some of its loan. The Reserve Bank took the decision to take that to hypothecate its gold without consulting the then government, because it was a lame duck government. 46.91 tons of gold had to be hypothecated with the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan to raise only $400 million. The incident that I'm talking about is that when this gold was being transported from the strong rooms of the Reserve Bank in Bombay to the airport to be carried out, the convoy developed a puncture on the way to the airport. You can imagine how many people must have been stressed and burst their veins or burst their lungs, thinking what will happen because of the valuable commodity that was being transported. The tension was such that Dr. Rangarajan says was totally, we were all sitting at the edge of our seats, one to ensure that the convoy reaches the airport safely and takes on. Reserve Bank versus the government, braving the demonetization. No analysis of the Reserve Bank functioning would be complete without this. Now, what exactly happened, nobody knows. How the discussions took place is also not known. But what Dr. Rangarajan, Raghuram Rajan, the then governor, has mentioned was, I was asked by the government in February 2016 for my views on demonetization, which I gave orally. Although there might be long-term benefits, I felt that the likely short-term costs would far outweigh them. And I felt that there were potentially better alternatives to achieve the main goals that the government was seeking to achieve. I made these views known in no uncertain terms. I was then asked to prepare a note which the RBI put together and handed to the Parliament. The RBI flagged what would happen if preparation was inadequate. The rest, of course, we all know the difficulties that we were faced and all that happened, because this was the advice rendered by the RBI, but it was the executive which finally took the decision that notes of 500 denomination or 1,000 denomination would not be legal tender anymore. Now, RBI has a huge accountability to the public as much as it has to the government. And because it has a well-defined mandate to regulate banking. Banking is a service extended as much to the man on the street as to the government. If the common man is being overcharged for transferring money from his workplace in the city to his family in the village, or if I am being overcharged for the amount outstanding on my credit card, or being charged to draw from the ATM of another bank while my account is in a third bank, it is the responsibility of the central bank to ensure that services rendered to be by commercial banks are efficient and reasonable. Hence the role, efficacy, and alertness of the central bank impinge very much on the common man too. And there have been substantial changes after 1970, post-1991 era brought forth a large number of complexities. The RBI had to play not only a supportive role, but a very proactive role in this transformation. But one of the secrets of successful emerging economies has been that the central banks responded and transformed their ideology and regulatory culture to meet the need of the hour. Put in this perspective, lots of people have said, it's argued, that the RBI should be made autonomous. But you cannot make it completely autonomous from the executive. But at the same time, I rush to clarify that the RBI need not be subservient to the executive. It has to choose and achieve a fine balance to be an effective defender of the monetary policy space. And that's how the healthy tension comes about. One bothering about inflation, the other, the fiscal authority, worried about growth. But in the final analysis, how autonomous the institution is and how independent the governor can be will depend very much on the person who occupies that chair. And this is where I come back to my earlier point, that it is not the structure alone of the institution that determines its efficacy. It's the capability, dexterity, statecraft, and resilience of the person who sits within that structure. And that person determines the vulnerability or fortitude and inviolability of that particular institution. Now, I wanted to deal with these institutions only, but Mr. Anand had made a request. Mr. Anand Raghavan had mentioned that I should touch on corporate governance also. I am not an insider to corporate governance. I have seen corporate governance and good corporates or otherwise functioning from outside only. But of course, I'd like to say that good governance is not the sole responsibility of the government alone. It is as much a requirement in the corporate sector. It transcends into civil societies, non-governmental organizations, and citizens groups. In fact, I saw it in sports bodies also. However, because the government spends on behalf of the public, it has a higher accountability. That's about all. But I must mention that no business can be sustainable unless it is built on an edifice of integrity and accountability. Good governance in the corporate sector is as vital as it is in any other institution. And I wish to draw attention only to two issues. One is in the corporate sector, the desire to beat competition and earn brownie points does drive persons to walk the thin line bordering on legality and immorality. To get ahead of competition and earn some more profit for the company cannot be justified on grounds of being legal. So what if it is immoral? You can take a shortcut once and succeed. You may take it again and probably still succeed. But the next time you try, you may land up in a Bear Stearns kind of a situation, or the financial meltdown, which brought of the toxic assets which were sold in Europe and all other parts of the world, which really brought economies to their knees. And that's why I say it's not legality alone, it's morality, integrity of the institution which matters. Now, it is not the health of the balance sheet only, but it's the ethical content in the balance sheet which is now being studied. And for decades, business executives have been chasing the bottom line in the balance sheet to produce shareholder value, create higher market valuations. Now, there are non-financial informations now which are not finding a place in mainstream reports. They are not being reported with the same discipline and rigor as financial information is being reported. Now, such an approach should also lead to high quality information that can be used in stakeholders concerned about sustainability of enterprises and investments. And as CEOs, we need to achieve twin objectives. Create long-term value to shareholders by delivering solid returns and at the same time operating a sustainable business model that addresses the long-term goals of society also in its vision. I don't want to say more, I've already overstepped my time. In concluding, I'd like to say that the agenda for nation building through good governance and through institutions has embedded within it an agenda for building institutions empowered to question and monitor ways every action of government and persons in authority. Such a movement we have to ensure, we have to orchestrate, the citizen must take forward to ensure that the independence and autonomy of these institutions is maintained. The institutions have a mandate, they have been created for a purpose, and they deserve to be kept independent to fulfill that mandate. People managing these institutions will require training and equipping to work without fear or favor. Media and civil society organizations must show alacrity and ensure vigilance over the performance of these institutions. It is only an informed citizenry, you and I, the ultimate stakeholder in any democracy, who can ensure an effective and responsive governance structure that creates institutional capability to build an administration premised on an edifice of probity, accountability, and transparency. And if we can do that to a very large extent, we would be doing great service to the memory of Mr. Nani Palkhiwala. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be amongst all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vinod Rai. In fact, I wish on behalf of the trustees that this was actually a physical meeting. And if it had been a physical meeting, I would have requested everybody to stand up and give you a thundering applause. This has been one of the best speeches we've had over the last 37 memorial lectures. This would rank clearly somewhere at the top. And you've presented a landscape which has been extremely difficult to paint, but you brought it out so nicely with all your experience and picking up the three institutions which are the pillars of governance: Parliament, Judiciary, and the Reserve Bank of India. And sir, you've very rightly said, trust can never be demanded. It has to be earned, trust and respect. And the message which is coming out very clearly from your talk is, while we can build institutional framework for good governance, finally it is the individuals who are responsible to bring governance to the forefront. We have lots of questions, but I'll try to make it as presentable as possible. But the first question is my right to ask you a question, and this has been agitating my mind for a few months or few years. Sir, we live in a country where everything is prescriptive, particularly laws, regulations, governance are all prescriptive. How much do you think prescriptions aid good governance? Or do you think governance should be outside the domain of prescriptions? It has to be driven by your own conviction to do the right thing.
May I?
Yes, please.
Okay. See, you can't say they have to be outside prescriptions. Prescriptions in some way provide the parallel lines, provide the envelope within which governance takes place. So it is not necessary for you to be totally prescriptive or confined to those prescriptions. At times, it becomes necessary to push that envelope further. That is where the governance or the efficacy of the person who is governing comes forward. So I would sincerely believe that prescriptions have to be kept in sight, not in the letter, but in the spirit of it. But governance is something which is mandated by seeing societal welfare, the mandated objectives of the institution, and then you have to bring about this fine balance to ensure that, well, I don't want to go back into that, but the greatest good of the largest number is taking place in the decision that you will be taking. So I would not divorce the two. I would say you bring about a fine balance between them.
Very true, sir. And we live in an environment, sir, where if you violate the law, you get punished. At some point of time, you get caught, punishment is given to you. So therefore, the man who sticks to the law is definitely on a safer wicket compared to somebody who is violating the law. But are we not in a situation today where, and this is one question which has come, very interesting question, should you not be rewarding institutions which practice good governance, and should you not be rewarding outstanding individuals who practice good governance, just like you reward good taxpayers and honest taxpayers?
Mr. Anand, to the person who has asked this question, it's very interesting. If you were to be the person who was mandated to administer institution XYZ, would your governance instincts be determined by the reward that you were going to get? I think there is no reward or risk phenomenon in this. It's a chair that you occupy. And that chair gives you a very clear direction. Let me take an example. Dr. Subbarao, my esteemed colleague, and myself, we were both secretaries in the Ministry of Finance in 2008. I moved out to the Auditor General's office. He moved out to the Reserve Bank of India. I just talked about the healthy tension between the fiscal authority and the monetary authority. How do you expect Dr. Subbarao to function in the RBI? Was he to toe the government's line all the time? How do you expect the Auditor General to function? Be a cheerleader of the government or all the actions that the government was taking? So, no, I think a person who is a good administrator shouldn't look at the rewards. I think in the ultimate analysis, if he can stand in the evening, look himself into the mirror, look into his eyes and say, yes, I have delivered to my conscience, to my objective, I don't think there is any other requirement. If he's been true to himself, I don't think there is any further accountability required, any further reward that is required for anybody who's sitting within the portals of that office.
That's a very interesting and a telling statement, sir. Particularly, we are living in an environment that everybody wants to be recognized for something or the other. And coming from you, straight from your heart, to say you do your duty and that itself is a reward is a very revealing statement. There is another very interesting question. I know the querist, but I'm not naming him. What is your view on persons holding high offices in government, including that of Supreme Court, High Court judge, retired, CVC retired, CBI director retired, taking up positions in private organizations just after retirement, subject to cooling off, as directors, independent directors, advisors, etc. There's nothing illegal about it, but is it something to be encouraged?
Now, this can be looked at from 2 points of view. Left to myself, if I've had no public dealing, no dealing with the commercial institution to which I'm joining as a director, as an independent director, I don't think there is any harm in it. Why? And I'm making the point again. Do you think all my life or all my career, I've lived through my career and functioned with having thought 5 steps ahead that finally I will join the board of directors of XYZ company who will give me a sitting fees of rupees 1 lakh per sitting and give me a compensation or what is it called? Commission of 20 lakhs per annum or whatever it may be. No, I don't think that's correct. If I'm clear in my heart about that, in my mind about that, I don't think there's any. The only wrong would be that, say, you are going to a connected institution, which fortunately in this country has not happened. If I were the governor of the Reserve Bank, I retire 3 years later, I go and sit as the chairman of the board of directors of a commercial bank. It could be said that in my tenure, I have favored them with a direct connection. But look at the CVC, for example. The CVC deals with public institutions. So to a very large extent, if he has to go to a private body, we can't fault him. It's only what I would call the optical part of it. You can't fault a former CAG becoming, as mandated by the Supreme Court, chairman of a committee of administrators of BCCI, because between the CAG and the BCCI, there's no connection. Or the election commission, former chief election commissioner, becoming the chairman of a corporate body. Why I say this is because the corporate body is selecting him not because he has rendered them some favor 10 years back, but because the wealth of experience he's gained over 40 odd years that he has been in public service. And I think to that extent, I would not find fault with anybody joining that particular sector, because why should that expertise, that wealth of resource, wealth of expertise over these 40 years go waste? But again, as I said, as long as I have the conviction that I will be working in a fair and objective manner, I will not use my office as a director of board of governors or board of directors to open offices in government organizations. That's my take.
That is also a very interesting take that you have laid before the table, sir. The optics part is now gaining a lot of momentum and a lot of discussions, particularly in governance framework. And that is exactly now portrayed in the next question, which is coming up, is that the government has the distinction of pushing many legislations unrelated to money bills as money bills to avoid some problems with the Rajya Sabha, where the government probably didn't have a majority. How do you view this from an optics point of view? In fact, the same term has been used by the querist here.
Oh, well, Mr. Anand, this question is not strictly from the syllabus.
Yeah.
But anyway, considering the fact that I said I will target them by virtue of being insider, yes, there have been concerns. Concerns have been expressed. But again, it is an institution like the Supreme Court that I talked about, an institution like the Parliament that these don't have to have an authority monitoring them from outside. It's like the Constitution says, we the people, we elect our representatives. The representatives go and act on our behalf. But unfortunately, what happens is all governments before the election say maximum governance, minimum government. But what ultimately fans out is quite the reverse. Yes, questions have been raised about it, but there have been rulings either by the Speaker or the Chairman of the Rajya Sabha on these issues. And I think we need to abide by those rulings because ultimately they are persons who are mandated to give that ruling finally, and we need not look behind that.
Sir, you mentioned in your talk, and that was quite interesting, that the starting problem everywhere in governance is where you start, the appointment itself. The process of appointment, whether it's for the institutions, for corporates, for any other place where you go, that is the starting point. And do you think we've got our act right in our process of appointing the right people at the right place across institutions, Parliament, wherever it is? What do we need to do to correct that situation?
Yeah, I just obliquely brought that that process in when I talked about the Judicial Accountability Bill, collegium appointing judges and things like that. See, I sincerely believe, and government to a very large extent has done it also, that in appointing people to these constitutional or statutorily regulatory bodies, the views not only of the executive, but outside elements also must weigh in. For example, appointment of the CBI director. You have a collegium doing that appointment. There is a prime minister, there's a leader of the opposition, there's a judge of the Supreme Court nominated by the CJI, is nominee, and there's an expert also. I think that is the most fair way of appointing people to these high offices. And I think it was in 2002 when the constitutional reforms were under consideration, and the committee had given its report. And as during my tenure as the Auditor General in 2009, if I remember correctly, we had given a recommendation that even the Controller and the Auditor General should be appointed by a collegium. In a collegium, I mean a committee, by a panel of distinguished persons, of whom at least 2 persons should be from outside government. I mean, you could have the Prime Minister, you could have the Leader of the Opposition, you could have a representative of the Chief Justice of India. What we had recommended them was the Lokpal. He could be a member of that collegium or the panel, and at least 1 or 2 persons from outside. Call them experts, call them persons of distinguished background, whatever it may be. But it is very necessary in today's situation for the merits of the person being appointed being discussed, debated, and only then the appointment taking place. I very sincerely subscribe to that viewpoint.
That would be really, it will also help the entire ecosystem of good governance. If we have a process which is transparent, which is more broad-based, it will also help to get the right people at the right place.
You talked about trust, I talked about trust. That would help trust between the public and the government. Okay. And I think that's very important. The trust factor is very important.
And sir, this question has been raised by somebody. It was also in my mind. You have been a hardcore auditor all your life. C&AG is.
I've not been an auditor. Actually, I'm a green hornet auditing. I was a lowly paid civil servant who got transported into the job of the.
But anyway, you held the highest office of an auditor anybody could imagine himself to be. And the auditing as a process is now under challenge. There are lots of issues on how technology is overtaking the way you do audit, the mammoth size of organizations that need to be audited. Do you think fundamentally the whole design of audit needs to be looked at, not only from a C&AG perspective, but also from an audit perspective as a whole?
Certainly. See, audit, or the function of audit, I should say, is a dynamic function. It's an evolving function. Earlier you had compliance audit, financial audit, all transactional only. Later on, performance audit came into the picture. I refer to the World Economic Forum now talking about financial indicators also coming into, not audit premises, but coming into the balance sheet of any company. Lots of changes are taking place. The process of audit, the method of audit, issues that need to be audited, and the parameters along which they will be audited. I just happen to be on the board of trustees, the global board of trustees of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. And we are going through a process tying up with the World Economic Forum to create a matrix of how this entire thing has to be taken forward, because with the advent of IT, with the advent of artificial intelligence, the entire superstructure has to undergo a change. And whoever raised the question is absolutely spot on this particular aspect, where the auditing process has to go through an evolution. And the earlier it does that, the better, because I sincerely believe audit has to be one step ahead of accounting. Because today, at the click of a button, you can move millions across geographic boundaries. So to be able to either check that or to be able to monitor that, to do the oversight of that, the auditor has to be the best in terms of the functioning of accounting or the check on the functioning of accounting. And that's why I think it's very essential today. The good thing is that as far as India is concerned, government sector is concerned, the CAG has been very alert about this, training its own band of auditors abroad and within the countries with the latest techniques, with the latest developments in this field. So that's a happy day.
Yes, sir, you are absolutely right. Because the moment a government company gets a C&AG audit which is absolutely clean, it means that the company is spotlessly clean. That is the view, and that's not a perception, it's a reality, so to say. So the last question is around regulations. And I think this was a very important question. We seem to deal with regulations like a cricket match. Every time the ball goes to a particular place, the fielder is kept there. So our regulations have been historically known to be very reactive, but not proactive. But do you think there must be a fundamental shift in the way we look at regulations to make governance also more meaningful from a proactive standpoint rather than a reactive standpoint?
I think yes, you're absolutely right. As you commented, that's a very important factor. There are three things: audit, regulation, investigation, done by three different bodies. The auditor does the audit, the investigation is done by the investigating agency, and regulation is done by the regulatory authority. All three of these, there is, I think, regulation would be a loser if they were only reactive. All these three functions that I've pointed out, just like the auditor, must be one step ahead. The regulator must have the capacity to look into the future, be one step ahead and say, okay, things are developing along the following lines. Let me take an example, cryptocurrency. They're developing along the following lines. I need to have my regulations in place much before the evolution of that particular activity has taken place. So regulation, as I said earlier, and I'm very clear in my mind about this, that regulation would be a loser if they are only reactive, which means move, as you said, the fielder to where the ball has just come. What was the legend or the brilliance of Dhoni? MS's biggest capability today is says, he goes to the bowler and says, ball yahan dal, वो ऐसे मारेगा, yahan dal तो मैं fielder वहां खड़ा करता हूं. And that is exactly what happens. That's the regulator. The regulator should have the capacity to be able to visualize where things are getting to and prepare himself accordingly. And that's, I think, a successful regulator.
Thank you, sir. I think you have not only covered all the questions placed before you in right earnestness, giving the complete perspective about the issues on hand. We do have a few more questions, but we will try to deal with it on an offline basis. But once again, on behalf of the foundation, really admire the way you have handled the session and the Q&A session as well. I now hand it over to Mr. Mahalingam for the concluding remarks and the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Anand. As you said, this has been an extremely good lecture, and the interaction thereafter, after the lecture, was also extremely interesting and brought forth the complete experience of Mr. Vinod Rai through over decades of experience in the governance as well as regulatory kind of bodies. Whenever we decide to organize lectures under the Palkhiwala Foundation, we look back on what interested Mr. Palkhiwala in his life. As you know, he was the foremost jurist of his time, and therefore there have been legal issues that we have dealt with over a period of time. He was also one who extensively commented on the budget. His post-budget speeches used to be extremely well attended, and therefore economics has been a subject that we have addressed in these lectures. He was extremely interested in the values. One of his very, very good books was the India's Priceless Heritage. And therefore there have been lectures that we have organized in the areas of values, and governance was something that he was passionately interested in. And the speaker today, Mr. Vinod Rai, also talked about his contribution in ensuring that the basic structure of the Constitution is not violated. Therefore, governance is an issue that we thought we should examine as we organize lectures. And this lecture is essentially focused on it. Mr. Vinod Rai, of course, has brought to bear, as I said, his decades of experience. And what struck me was that right at the beginning, he made a pointer to an observation that Mr. Palkhiwala had made, namely that there was too much of government and too little of governance, too many laws and too little justice, and too many civil servants but too little of service. And I think what he has done in terms of tracing it over this period with these three institutions that he took as representative one, this is the Parliament, the Supreme Court, and the Reserve Bank of India. He has essentially gone into the outcomes, the fault lines that exist, and how they have shaped up. There are, of course, many issues that he has pointed out during his lecture, as well as in the interactions and so on. But I think, the sense that I was getting was that the structure is important, but at the same time, people who manage those structures are also equally important. I think this is one area that he has emphasized, and this is something that all of us have been interested in terms of shaping people's opinion, shaping people's thinking so that we are able to bring pressure on various institutions and so on to ensure that the right people go there and the right acts are performed. So all in all, it has been an extremely good lecture where we have addressed one of the key issues that Mr. Palkhiwala was concerned with, and we must thank Mr. Vinod Rai for the detailed observation on this and for taking the trouble to prepare the speech and deliver it so well. I was wondering why he had not used any of the cricket terms, and towards the end he also corrected it by talking about MS Dhoni and the practice that he brought. So thank you very much, sir, for this very, very interesting lecture, which will go as one of the best lectures in the Palkhiwala Foundation series. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was indeed very nice of you all to have invited me. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.